Football is back 41 days after Norwich City's final Premier League game of the season against Tottenham Hotspur. They returned to action at Oldham Park against Dereham Town in their opening pre-season friendly of the 2022-23 season. It seems to have come so quickly, and yet that period probably was enough, I think, for the break that everyone needed just to recover from and recuperate from what was a very draining Premier League season last time around. Hopefully that's the last time that we mention it. Welcome to this week's PinkUn Norwich City Podcast. I'm Connor Southwell, joined by Seaman and Paddy, Davitt to review that 4-0 win over Dereham and also to dissect and talk about some other Norwich City issues that's happened in the last week or so. So Sam, let's start with you then. We were all at kind of Oldham Park on Friday night. The sun was shining for the majority of it. There was a little bit of rain, and it did feel like a clean slate. I think there was a lot of talk about how it would feel once Norwich City returned to action. The squad hasn't dramatically changed. The kit has changed. Everything else really was kind of the same. All of the players who played were on the books of Norwich City last season. Obviously, no Isaac Hayden in action. It still felt to me like a fresh start, though, which I think is probably what everyone needed, given, as we said, what we saw last season.
Yeah, and I think the number of under-23s players involved also helped with that. Obviously, a lot of fresh faces, and as you said, players that were on the books last season, but not too many players that were actually responsible for the car crash of a season that 2021-22 was. You know, you look at the key players. I think Todd Cantwell, Jordan Hugill, first half, obviously both spent the second period of last season out on loan. Same as Sam McCallum, who played at left back. Angus Gunn was in goal, having only really competed for that number one spot in goal towards the end of the season. So I don't think there were too many faces that you'd immediately associate with last season. I think that helped. As you said, obviously the visual elements like the kit do help, and obviously winning 4-0, even if it's against Dereham Town, I think any football fan would struggle to feel too gloomy after that. So no, there were a lot of positive elements. It did feel like a fresh start. It felt positive, and I think you noticed that from like the conversations we had with Dean Smith. What I saw from you talking to Sam McCallum after the game as well, there seemed to be a lot more lightheartedness around, and Dean Smith didn't look like a man that had been weighed down by the pressure of having to save a squad that clearly wasn't good enough for the Premier League. So yeah, I think there was a lot of optimism for understandable reasons, and hopefully they can capitalise on it when the games get a little bit more serious and a little bit more tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come on to the game in a little while, although you'll understand there's only so much you can analyse of the game because of the difference in levels of the two teams. So it's difficult to maybe go into the football match in too much depth as we perhaps would do in a game that Norwich City have participated in, certainly will be doing when the Championship fixtures come around. But just because of the sheer difference, it's difficult to really look too much probably into what we saw on Friday night. But Pad, I mean, the same question for you, really. Did it feel like a kind of a new start for you, a page being turned? Certainly for Dean Smith, it felt like that was necessary, given probably what he inherited, which was a little bit of a mess, if we're being honest, in Premier League terms and sort of on the footballing pitch. He didn't have too much to work with. Norwich City got relegated probably in the fashion that maybe we probably expected when Daniel Farke was dismissed. It did feel like a little bit of a fresh start. And maybe Sam's right. Maybe that is because of the large quantity of young players that were involved. And of course, obviously 10 players who we're yet to see in pre-season because of the international schedule.
I'd be inclined to agree. I think the only freshness for me would be the sight of a Gibbs, a Flynn Clark, et al. You know, those type of players who aren't really tainted by in the main what happened last season. So, but I don't know whether I've been doing this too long now, but I would need to see substantially more evidence over pre-season that it is going to be different because, as you say, in short order, that the international contingent will flow back into the group who are out in Germany now, and you know a lot of those will then edge those younger players aside. I think that's logical to assume because you know did a piece for the app over the weekend. You know how much is Smith willing to gamble by blooding more allied to a Johnny Rowe or a Tony Springett? Not sure at the outset for reasons that we all know. It's imperative they get off to a positive start. So we don't think there's going to be huge turnover in terms of the transfer window between now and the end of the transfer window / start of the new season. So I think it'll be a lot of familiar faces, and that for me doesn't feel per se like a page is being turned. What would feel like a page is being turned is if we can look back maybe 10 games into the championship season. They've got a good haul of points. There's a style of play that's clear now under Dean Smith. And to be fair to him, he was right when he pointed out the sort of the ability or to counter press, as he said, and he made the point it was Dereham, and you have to make allowances for the level of opposition. But irrespective of who you're playing, it's clear that Dean Smith wants to win the ball back, wants to press high, wants to be aggressive, particularly across that midfield area, and that to me is a marked departure from what he inherited and what he tried to implement in the Premier League. So I think I need a lot more convincing that it's going to be different and it is a fresh start, and that there is a new direction of travel under this head coach and his assistant and his other coaches, and you can see where they're trying to get to, and the path is clear. And obviously we didn't see Isaac Hayden, and he's the only new senior signing who's come through the door, and I think he will have a big role to play, which again, Dean, when I put it to him after the game at Aldiss Park, made it quite clear he feels he will be a leader and very swiftly will be one of the go-to people within that 11. So, we didn't see him at Aldiss Park. He was there sat watching, probably a game or two too early for him, Dean Smith said, factoring in, he had his injury problems last season. The pitches are very hard still at this early stage of pre-season. No risks being taken with him or a Sam Byram or Sergeant Omabama Daly either. All of those, allied to all the internationals coming back in, not even talked about Onel Hernandez and Daniel Sanani, who are yet to be seen, but will, Dean Smith indicated, get their chance over pre-season. So for me, no, a little bit too early in the piece to feel that this is a new era, and we saw the start of it at Aldiss Park. Let's see where we are come, Cardiff certainly on the opening day of the championship season, but for me, probably broaden it out and let's fast forward about 10 or so league games, and then I think we'll have a very clear sense of, this feels fresh, this feels new, this feels exciting and optimistic and positive, and all of those, I'm sure a lot of Norwich fans will crave because, in contrast, none of those applied last season. I think it's safe to say.
Absolutely, and we'll come on to maybe the transfer front or lack of in the second half of the pod. We're going to spend a little bit of time just talking and reflecting on Friday night's game. As I said, maybe not the mechanics of the football duel that we saw too much, but maybe certain themes that we kind of picked out. And, Paddy, you spoke about the midfield there, and it does feel like Dean Smith does want a dynamic, energetic midfield that can press and is capable of pressing perhaps in a more intelligent way. Certainly any kind of evidence that you watch from his time at Aston Villa, Brentford as well, or maybe in a slightly more limited way, suggests that is the direction of travel he wants to head in. We saw it in many ways in his opening game in charge against Southampton, where he made that subtle tweak in midfield that just pushed, I think it was Kenny McLean and was it Billy Gilmore up slightly, and that just improved Norwich City's output and what they did in that game and almost swung the pendulum in their favour. That's kind of the direction to me it feels like, which is why it was so interesting, Sam, to see Todd Cantwell not just feature in a Norwich City shirt, which we'll get back onto in a minute, but in the role that he did. It was a number 8, which is kind of what Scott Parker tried to do with him at Bournemouth last year, and he didn't quite manage to make it work. Plus, he felt he had probably better and maybe even more reliable options as Bournemouth were gunning for promotion. So it's not a completely new concept to Todd, but it's a new concept for Norwich City and Todd Cantwell. And he, I think it's fair to say, was one player that I looked at, again, with the context, with the caveats of the level of their opponents, which we have to do throughout this discussion. But it just looked like a happy Todd Cantwell to me, which is something that we've not seen in a Norwich shirt for a little while.
Yeah, and he looked like he wanted to be there, which I think made a change from a couple of times sort of towards the end of his spell with Norwich last season. And I think he's probably made the smart decision there, really, for his own career. Writing a piece that's probably going to go out tomorrow on the app, actually, and I've made the point that he's not going to get a club that's better than the favourites for Premier League promotion. We've seen the links so far. Blackburn Rovers are the only sort of named club that we've seen. There's also been, noises around a potential foreign loan to a maybe slightly less prestigious sort of country or league. And why would he not? Why would he want to be anywhere other than Norwich City, given the alternatives? He's got a great opportunity, given Dean Smith has clearly opened the door to him. After he said to us after the match as much, really, he said Cantwell's, he's been training well, but he's sick of the talking. He just wants to see some action on the pitch from him, and I think that's what he saw at Dereham. Obviously, same caveats as we're going to be adding for the whole of this conversation, really, was that it was Dereham, and I think that's what makes it difficult to perhaps judge the extent to which he'll thrive in this new role, because effectively, when you're playing against that much of a low block and that much of a team that are underdogs, sort of everyone apart from your one centre back and your goalkeeper is a number 10 in that situation, really. So it was difficult to judge his capabilities maybe there, and if that is going to be the role he plays, I'm looking forward to seeing him perhaps against other sides. But we've seen before that he's happy to do the other side of the game. I remember a performance at Goodison Park, getting on for 3 years ago now. I think that was in his real phase of trying to kick on and prove people wrong and prove that he was up to the level. And I remember some fantastic backtracking runs and some big sliding tackles. So I think if he puts his mind to it, he's got the enthusiasm and the energy to play the role. And that was what he seemed to have at Dereham, that enthusiasm, which I think he's been lacking for a little while now. And it's understandable that he was lacking that on loan at Bournemouth. Probably quite isolated for the first time in his footballing career, other than a time at Fortuna Sittard when they were, basically on the way to promotion. So you can understand why he's maybe lacked that enthusiasm for a little while, but it was excellent to see that back in his play. And if he can keep that against the bigger teams, we've seen him do it against the likes of Arsenal and Manchester City before. If he can do that, he'll definitely impress in pre-season and hopefully in the Championship as well. Yeah,
and I think I said I wasn't going to do football analysis, but a little bit of football analysis. I felt that Norwich weren't as penetrative in the second half when he was off the pitch. It felt maybe things were a little bit tighter, and Dereham were tiring as well to an extent, which probably had an impact. But it didn't feel like they were cutting through Dereham with the same ease as they were in the first half. Again, you can read as much into that as maybe you'd like. But I mean, Sam touched upon it there, Paddy. In terms of Norwich's midfield more broadly, there does need to be, as we've said, a restructure, a better balance. Probably Dean Smith moving to a midfield trio is what it feels like in a 4-3-3. That was the system that we saw in both halves on Friday night, although a lot of that may be about who he has available rather than kind of his preferred system, although that is again what he played at Villa and at Norwich at times as well. But if you are going to have Todd Cantwell in that role, it does feel like the structure around him would need to be right, as maybe wasn't the case for someone like Billy Gilmore last season, for example. But also, I mean, as Sam said there, the sort of, to quote Elvis Presley, a little less conversation, a bit more action, please, that Dean Smith was kind of asking for Todd Cantwell. That does kind of feel like where everyone is, because I think the frustration around him, and we've spoken about him to death on this podcast and written about him to death as well, and his situation and what a great shame it was, and probably how we weren't expecting to see him in yellow and green again, if we're being completely transparent about it, and how probably the route was a loan move away until the expiration of his contract. But if we do see what Dean Smith is asking of him and that consistency, and maybe a cynic would say there was a lot of narratives around Friday's game, the fact it was at Dereham, the homecoming, there was a lot of his family that we saw milling around Oldest Park as well. There's maybe a point to prove on his part, but the frustrations around him as a footballer is that everyone knows his capabilities, and there is an argument to say that Norwich are looking for a creative presence. Maybe he is the player that they need. It's that cliched a new signing thing, isn't it? But there's also that on his game and in full form, he could represent a better player than they may be able to attract this summer anyway. So it does feel like a win-win for both sides. But yet, as Sam says, it still feels like there's a lot to do before we kind of are suggesting that we're going to see Todd Cantwell line up for Norwich City on July the 30th against Cardiff.
Yeah, again, without wishing to repeat what we said, I mean, it was Dereham. It was the very, very gentlest of opening pre-season friendlies. I think anybody who extrapolates anything from that game, really, in terms of what that means for Norwich in the Championship season, I think they're probably wide of the mark. I mean, fundamentally, the ball's in his court now, and that's the sense I got from those comments and the way Dean Smith delivered them. Not exasperation, but almost like I've spoken to this guy at length, and you can read between the lines because ultimately, when he first came in and took over from Daniel Farker, who came back from the relative wilderness, Todd Cantwell, he was straight back in. That tells you all you need to know about the guy's reputation for a coach coming in who'd obviously seen what Todd Cantwell was all about, probably the previous Premier League season, and that he could influence a game at the highest level. And as I say, with hindsight, and Dean Smith acknowledged it, physically, fitness-wise, he wasn't there. He wasn't at the level to be able to influence games. But as a footballer, he didn't need to convince Dean Smith because Dean Smith brought him back in. And I get the distinct sense that he's tried to get inside Todd Cantwell's head and try to light a fire under him. And ultimately, it got to the point where, come January, he decided enough was enough, and off he went to Bournemouth with a buy option. Worth reiterating that, that isn't something a club in Norwich's position would have agreed to if Dean Smith felt Todd Cantwell was part of his longer term plans. As it turned out, he didn't end up going to Bournemouth. They didn't take out the buy option. He comes back. Norwich protect themselves by exercising the 12 months as they did with Timu Pukki. But there's a hell of a row back that needs to happen for it to come from that position where essentially Dean Smith and Norwich City were willing to let Todd Cantwell go this summer, to now he is the answer to that creative midfield quest. It can happen. It is possible. There's plenty of examples throughout football in previous times of players who seemingly looked like they were out the door and managed to work their way back in. But fundamentally, for Dean Smith, it clearly has to come from Todd Cantwell. The ball is in his court now. He has to show, in terms of his performance level on the pitch, in terms of how he carries himself around the group, in terms of how he interacts, the body language, the positivity. Dean Smith needs to see that on a regular basis now to, I think, feel that, right, I can trust this guy. Yes, we'll keep him in the building now, and he can be a big player for us this season. I think there's a lot of imponderables there at the moment, at this very early stage of pre-season, to suggest that Todd Cantwell is firmly back in the mix. For me, I still think it tips more towards we get to the end of the summer, end of the transfer window, and he's probably not part of it. But, while he's here and while he's seemingly happy with life and enjoying being part of it, then who knows? Because fundamentally, there is a player who I think is as good as any in the current Norwich squad in terms of that creative element that they could add in that part of the pitch, a key part of the pitch. But for that to happen, it's got to come from Todd Cantwell. And Sam's points are right. I don't think he could get a better gig currently now than Norwich City, who you would reasonably expect to be competing at the right end of the Championship. He's not getting any younger. He's probably seen others of his own peer group bypass him and move on. In terms of the game more generally, not Norwich per se. At some point, if he's to fulfil his potential, which he still is capable of doing, it needs to click. And if it's not going to be Norwich, it needs to click elsewhere. But it needs to click. And, he cannot afford another season like the last one that he had, where he's on the margins at two different clubs. And basically, he's wasting his talent fundamentally. So we would all hope that it's to happen here, but I still feel it's probably going to be a part in other ways. But while he's in the building, then of course, and while Norwich haven't addressed that creative midfield deficit in terms of the transfer window, then why wouldn't you, if you're Dean Smith and Stuart Webber more broadly, why wouldn't you look at Todd Cantwell and think this guy could be the answer for us and give him the platform and the opportunity? But then he has to pick up the baton and he has to run with it. And really, I think fundamentally, whether he stays or goes will rest on Todd Cantwell and what Todd Cantwell feels he wants to be. Does he want to be a part of this? And if so, showing Norwich and Dean Smith that he wants to be part of it. And it's not enough really just to come back and, as Dean Smith intimated, he's been really good around the place and everything he's asked of him, he has delivered. That needs to now happen over a much broader period of time. And if that does happen, then who knows? But it's positive that there is possibly a way back, but it still feels like a lot of miles that have to be covered by Todd Cantwell in order for really you get to Cardiff on the opening weekend and Todd Cantwell's in that 11. I just don't see it, frankly.
No, and I guess from Norwich's perspective, from what you've said there in terms of kind of Todd and the expectation, and I'd probably feel the same, that come the end of the summer transfer window, which ends in September, it probably does feel like the most likely outcome is for him not to be a Norwich City player. But in that regard, I suppose it's maybe a win-win for Norwich, because they either have Todd Cantwell, someone who, as we all know, is a wonderful footballer when he's on it and happy and firing and in form, or they go with the plan that they probably already formulated anyway without him involved, and it's up to him to kind of disprove that. And maybe what this represented was a flicker of light, and less so kind of the football. And yes, he was involved in the 2 goals, but actually it was the willingness to receive the ball. It was the creativity that he displayed, and it just added something, I felt, to Norwich City's play, again with the caveat of who the opposition is. Now let's see if he goes and does it on Saturday against Bundesliga 2 opposition as well. I mean, if we talk about the game more generally, Jordan Hugill scored Norwich City's first 2 goals. One was a header from a set piece. The second one, again, Cantwell clipped a wonderful pass in to spring it. It would have been a penalty had Jordan Hugill not have tapped it in. That was then saw Norwich change 11s completely in the second half. Both 11s were kind of a mix of experienced first-team players and young players, 2 of which combined for the third goal. Flynn Clark sort of teeing up Tom Dixon-Peters to slot away for free, and then Kieran Dow netted a penalty late on after John Rowe was bundled over by Ross Bilham. So that was kind of the story as was. Norwich, as you expect, would have lots of the ball. Probably could have had more. Credit to Dereham for the fact that they conceded after 7 minutes. I think a lot of people inside Oldest Park would maybe have expected that to go one way, and it didn't. So that was a positive.
Then what have you got in Isaac Hayden's first time we've had a chance to really speak to you about him? What will he bring that maybe you didn't feel you had in the group last season?
Hayden, an understanding and knowledge of both the Premier League and the Championship, an understanding of the game. Can win the ball back very well for you. His stats in terms of repeated sprints are very good, and he handles the football really well as well. So I think he'll be one of the leaders within the dressing room, even though he'll be new. I think that's just his style and his character. So from what I've seen so far, really excited to work with him.
I mean, you said towards the end of the season you'd like to maybe add a bit of creativity in the midfield area, top end of the pitch, that sort of link player. Is that still?
Yeah, that's still one that we're looking at as well.
And you've got, obviously, when everybody's fit and available, that's a lot of numbers you've got there, and we've seen already Shemi maybe getting linked with Birmingham. Anything in that?
I've no idea. I'd leave that to Stuart, as you know.
But in a broader point, you'd look to maybe trim it a little bit, because that's a lot of players to carry.
Yeah, no, the squad will need trimming, that's for sure. We've got 10 players coming back from international duty, so to carry that many going into the season is too many. But we want to give all the players the opportunity to start with, the likes of Anel Hernandez, Anel Sinani, coming back from their loan periods. Sam's obviously played tonight with Jordan, scored a couple. So we want to give them all the opportunity to show us what they're about as well. And make decisions then on what we need to keep and what we need to move on.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Like you said, there's a lot of lads you know about, but you haven't actually seen them close up. So are you really still very open-minded in that regard, and we'll look at it now over pre-season?
Yeah, totally. As I say, it's an opportunity for some of these young lads as well. Tony and Jonathan got their opportunities last season, and some of the young 23s have had a chance as well, and they'll have a further chance next week in Germany.
Just final point, I mean, Germany, as you say, what are you looking now for this week now, to go out there and a bit of bonding as well as the football side? It'll
be a bit of bonding as well as the football, but there'll be a couple of doubles and treble sessions while we're out there as well, so a couple of early rises for them. It's I really like going away with the players, because it's 24/7. You really get to see them and know about them and learn about them. And gives us that opportunity now.
Final one for me. We don't want to hark back to last season, but do you get the sense now you're back in, like you've had a week or two to work with the guys, that the page has turned and everybody can look forward now and have a bit of optimism?
Yeah, no, the page has turned. It's gone. We're concentrating now on this season and what we can do.
Cheers, Dan.
Just one from me. That's right. You brought Todd Cantwell back in today. What are you hoping to see from him in pre-season?
Yeah, and I had a chat with Todd at the end of last season, and I said, the time. We've had a couple of chats previously. There's no point in us keep talking about things now. We all want to see action on the football pitch, and he's coming in. He's trained really well so far, and and that's what he needs to continue doing, and he knows that.
We live Norwich City.
The build-up.
The passion.
The drama.
the last-minute winners.
The debate.
That's why we've created PinkUn Plus.
The app that takes you beyond the headlines.
With exclusive columns, blogs, podcasts and videos, we've got you covered.
Subscribe today. PinkUn Plus. Stay ahead of the game.
Download now on the App Store and on Google Play. So if we start with your reflections on that game overall, probably on the pitch first, and then we'll probably speak about the occasion in general.
Yeah, I think on the pitch it was obviously a tough game for us, as we knew it was going to be. But we stuck in there, and for us it was just about making sure we were honest throughout until the end, and we were. And for us, we've had two pre-season training sessions, and we're in against Norwich for the first pre-season friendly. So we knew we were going to suffer. But I thought we held in there. Obviously, their quality, their ability on the ball, their movement, their interchanges, brilliant. And it's fantastic for our boys to play against that. Great for us to watch it from the sides and be close to it and see what they do. And they were obviously very good side. They had probably 90% of the ball, I'd say, and as we expected. But for us, we stuck at it, like I say. We wanted to make sure we tried to make it as difficult as we could for them, and I felt we did that, with an honest performance. And obviously the class showed, over the game as we expected. But really pleased with what we've done tonight. Yeah.
And just finally, obviously we saw basically every side of this ground full. There were queues when I arrived at 4:30. I think there were queues when you arrived as well. The bar was full. There was people queuing for burgers. I mean, good night all round for the football club as an occasion, as a spectacle, and obviously financially as well.
Yeah, it is. And what I'd say about Norwich is that they're really their self-awareness to a club like this is I thought was exemplary tonight. They knew what tonight meant to us as a football club as well, and I think the way they've approached it, they've played obviously players that that are first team players, which again has attracted people to come here. And even little things like they've tweeted the game and stuff, and it just generates that interest, and I'm just so thankful to them and how they've been, and they're just a class act today, I've got to say. Just everything about it, obviously on the pitch, but off the pitch, they're really, really respectful, and I just can't thank them enough, for having a game with us, and that sets us up so well for this season. That's probably a good portion of our budget for the season in one night, which is just brilliant. And there's nights like that you just have to capitalise, and think we have tonight, so that's great.
On their behalf as well. I think this is probably the right time for us to bring you some audio from both of the managers. So here's Paddy's chat with Dean Smith, and then afterwards here's me catching up with Dereham Town boss Adam Gusterson. Okay then, gents, if we pick this up then in terms of where Norwich City are in the transfer window, because it's obviously the hot topic, and myself and Sam have come off the Q&A. We're recording this on Monday afternoon, where that has basically dominated the whole of the discussion. So Pat, if we start with you, really, I feel that certainly at this time of the summer, where pre-season's beginning and maybe not a lot from a Norwich City perspective has happened, there's always kind of this desperation to see something, particularly when fans are seeing clubs like Burnley and other clubs who maybe could be in and around Norwich City next season make additions and strengthen. I think Cardiff are on their 50th signing or something like that. It feels like they sign someone every other week. But it is kind of that, to me, it feels like a desperation for a club to be seen to be doing something. It is a lot of what transfer window is, a lot of kind of posturing and whatnot. It's been pretty deadly silent from a Norwich City perspective, both in terms of incomings and outcomings. So if we start with the incomings, obviously Isaac Hayden has arrived, so they've made one addition. I guess the question people will want asking is, why is what has followed since been so quiet? Why has it been so I guess a void that hasn't been filled with rumours or speculation or links to players or even deals being done?
Well, I mean, ultimately, there's the primary factor there for me is the financial situation. We've touched on this at length in various broadcasts that we've done pretty recently on these channels. And, fundamentally, you take your lead from Stuart Webber's comments at the end of last season that they could do one or two pieces of business and then anything else dependent on outs. Well, Isaac Hayden is clearly one or two of those other pieces of business. Dean Smith confirmed again as he did at the end of last season. But after Friday night's game at Dereham, they're still desperate to bring in a creative midfielder. However you want to package up, whatever label you want to put on that. Is it a 10? Is it an 8? Are they box to box? Or are they more of a wide operator in those middle thirds if he's going with a 3 and a 3? So, but essentially somebody who can unlock doors, somebody who can link with your strike force, somebody who can add goals and assists in decent quantities. That's what I read into that desire to bring somebody in. But fundamentally, as the Scott Twine sort of deal to Burnley would underline, if that's the going rate for that type of player, 4 million plus, Norwich don't have those funds right here, right now. And that's why it feels very much a holding pattern. Yes, of course, there's plenty of work will be going on in the background. They will be, as in Stuart Webber, primarily in constant dialogue with agents, representatives, other clubs, and they will have plans in place ready to go. But fundamentally, that can only happen if the finances are there. And, if it is increasingly now dependent on, hypothetically, a Max Aarons departing, a Mila Rashica departing, a Christos Jolis departing, not all three, but maybe one of, to facilitate those plans, then really it's putting the pieces in the right order at the right time, and that hasn't fundamentally happened yet. They haven't managed to shift those players, and the nature of how these things get put together with the bigger deals is, for Norwich, is probably going to be towards the end of the window, certainly closer to the start of the season, before there is tangible, firm movement out, which would then facilitate in. I mean, I got the sense that if they could do an exit or two, then it might end up being more than the 1 or 2 that Stuart Webber indicated. But, very much that messaging for me was designed to lower expectations and not to expect maybe a Cardiff-style turnover in terms of volume. That simply isn't going to happen. You're ignoring what Stuart Webber said in that interview at the end of the season, but what Dean Smith said ad nauseum about we don't need to make wholesale changes. I feel I've got the majority of a squad good enough to stay at the right end of this division they're going into. So essentially it's targeted, and targeted means pretty low numbers in terms of financial availability of players, but also maybe what Dean Smith feels is needed. He doesn't feel it needs a wholesale top to bottom root and branch overhaul in terms of personnel, because in order to, even if the finances were there to do that and basically mould almost a brand new team and a brand new squad to pick up results to be competing at right end of the championship in one window, very, very difficult, nigh on impossible. So for me, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that we're sat here, pre-season is underway, and they've made one signing, and that is essentially a loan deal as it stands. Yes, there are caveats which could turn Isaac Hayden's move into a permanent from Newcastle, but right now they've made one loan signing. That to me tells you exactly where they are in terms of the finances, and crucially, and that what they do inward will hinge pretty much exclusively on what they can do outward. And as we sit here recording this, Max Aarons is a Norwich player, Mia Rashica is a Norwich player, Christos Jolis is a Norwich player. And until any of that or any other players potentially you could go out the door changes, then I think it's going to be a bit more holding pattern for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of it after relegation felt quite reactive, and that's understandable from a supporter's perspective of why maybe you would want the squad overhauled after the season that we all watched, and a lot of players proving that they weren't good enough at the level that ultimately Norwich City are trying to sustain themselves at. But Sam, it almost feels to me like you have to take a step back from that. You have to recognise that the standard of football is going to be significantly lower next season. Norwich City probably are going to be able to compete at the top end of the championship in whatever form that looks like, unless something goes drastically wrong, in which case probably there would then be a change of coach, which we would expect. But this kind of approach to continuity probably is what we expected, I would say. But also there will be a lot of people looking at it and saying that's fine, and the focus clearly has to be on next season. But there'll be people looking longer than that, and they'll be saying, well, when Norwich City get themselves back in the Premier League, if they do so with a massive core of the squad that was part of last season's disaster is probably a bit strong, but certainly relegation. What's changed? What's different? What's new about that season? So it does feel like people are maybe looking a season in advance to this, but can you kind of understand why people are doing that, given where Norwich City are at this moment in time?
Yeah, because the end goal isn't just to get promoted again, is it? The end goal is to break the cycle and stay in the Premier League. So you can understand why fans are already looking ahead to that task. Obviously, it's not a given whatsoever that they're going to be promoted, but it is a valid point because the fact is the last time they went up to the Premier League, they sold their best player and they lost their second best player back to his parent club because it was a loan deal, and you can understand them. You can understand fans wanting to secure that future because as strange as it sounds, they're bored of Championship promotion and they're used to Championship promotion, and that's not the point anymore. Norwich are used to Championship promotion, and everybody expects them to get promoted every time they're in the Championship. So you can understand them looking ahead to it. To sort of address your earlier points about the level, I do think that you have to sort of take a step back and see it within the context of the competition that they'll be facing. You look at somebody like Pierre-Les Malou, lots of experience in the top flight in France, has now got a Premier League season under his belt. Milo Rashica, well regarded in Germany, of course, with other likes of Aston Villa in recent years. And, all these players that they signed for multi-million pounds, yes, it didn't work out for them, but those players they still had to give Stuart Webber a reason to sign them in the first place. And those reasons and those talents still exist. I was speaking to a journalist that covers Huddersfield Town after they confirmed that they wouldn't be signing Daniel Sinani on a permanent deal. And he said that, to provide some context, they hadn't spent more than £1.5 million on a player in 3 years. And they finished, I think, third last season. That's the context of the league that Norwich are entering and the level of competition there is. And, I've seen a lot of fans of maybe more established Championship clubs that are upset about the parachute payment situation. And I'm sure there's plenty of reasons why Norwich fans would defend their club for that and would look to explain that. But it is a fact that the clubs in receipt of those parachute payments are in a much greater financial situation than their competition. And just because they can't spend £4, £5, £6 million on a player, which doesn't seem a lot in the current footballing climate, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to compete at the real top end of the Championship, both financially and on the pitch. They've still got the talents of those players that they brought in last season. And I think the main reason that people are overlooking why they maybe can't spend as much as fans might want this summer is that last summer feels like a long time ago, and the fact was they did spend a lot of money. By Norwich City standards, it was an enormous amount of money that they spent in the transfer market last summer. If they hadn't done that, if they had gone for a sort of 1.5 million type situation like they did in 2019, it might be that now they'd be looking at it with a really healthy budget to comfortably win the Championship. But as I said earlier, the goal isn't to get promoted again. The goal is to stay in the Premier League, and that was why they went all out last summer. That's why they maybe are having to bank on the squad they've already got this summer. So I'm sure there's going to be an adjustment period, and I understand why people have reacted the way they have after last season. But as you said, you just have to look at the context of the level they're competing at now. It's nowhere close to the Premier League, and I think the gap is widening.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's also worth noting that as we record this, it's the 4th of July. So they've still got quite a considerable amount of time to do more business, and they will do more business. That feels like it needs saying as well. But there's an interesting element as well, Paddy. We've kind of touched upon the financial stuff, but the size of their squad is really interesting as well, because it's a significantly bloated squad, 30 plus players. We've already mentioned a contingent of 10 players who are yet to kind of start pre-season off the back of Norwich playing a game where they fielded 2 separate 11s. It's a squad of 30 plus players. Obviously, how much of the under 23s you want to include in that squad is entirely up to you really. But do you find that situation interesting, given some of the remarks that Stuart Webber made when he first walked into the door in 2017 about big squads, and how there was a lot of players that Norwich City were maybe struggling to shift and get rid of, and that maybe is perceived to be certainly the situation that they're in at the moment. Dean Smith again on Friday, when it was in that that huddle, whether it was to you or not, I can't quite remember, but he spoke about a need to trim the squad further. We've already kind of reported about Przemysław Poeta, and it looks like he's out on loan. Christoph Solis, there's Mila Rashica as well. We could list several others. It probably doesn't feel like Onel Hernandez and Daniel Sanani are both going to be at Norwich City next season. So numerically, there's a struggle as well. But what do you make more broadly of the way Norwich City squad looks at the moment, given perhaps some of the comments that Stuart Webber and others have made in the past as well?
Well, I mean, numbers-wise, it is on the bloated side, and Dean Smith acknowledged that and said it wasn't that we'll weigh it up. There will be departures, and you might see the start of that in very short order in terms of Poeta moving on. But I don't know. You'd have to take a step back and think about it in terms of the more broader point you're trying to make there, Connor, about, has Stuart Webber gone full circle from what he inherited, which was, I think, slightly different in terms of it was a lot of players on big money because they'd kind of oscillated between the two divisions, and maybe the financial contractual side of it wasn't quite as tightly policed as it certainly is now under his stewardship. And I think his point was they would have senior pros on good money who, when Saturday swung around in the Championship, were nowhere near the matchday squad. And that clearly isn't a healthy football situation in terms of that hunger that you want among a group of players who want to strive and push on and achieve things, because maybe they'd already achieved things and they were coming back down the other way in terms of their career path, or too many of them were in that group. But also the finances. What is the point in paying tens of thousands of pounds out to players who are not materially involved on a match day? That makes no sense whatsoever, certainly not within a self-funded model, which is very much the case at Carrow Road. So I think there are differences in terms of the processes that have led Norwich to maybe come back round again in terms of purely looking at the numbers. And you're right, if you maybe take out the 23s development young lads, the senior count isn't quite as bloated as it feels. But there's no doubt that successive windows have now left a bit of an imbalance in terms of the squad, both in terms of numbers and maybe certain areas of the park as opposed to other areas. We talk about the midfield looks a bit light in the centre of the park still, even with Hayden arriving. The fullback areas, if it was that Max Aaron's departed, you'd look at that area and is there enough cover there now? And so there is a bit of a imbalance, and and of course what's happened in the intervening period is Daniel Farker was very much working in tandem with Stuart and his recruitment types, and now Dean Smith comes in, and clearly he will have different views on those type of players that he inherited to maybe his predecessor, and that has to be factored in as well. But there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that if you boil that back down to what Stuart Webber said when he came in, that they needed a hungry group of players to drive standards up and drive that club forward again, it feels like there's a bit of work to be done in that area, because there are a lot of players there who've been on the journey for quite a number of seasons now. And, I don't want to really pick him out and say he's the problem, but a Christoph Zimmermann, who by no manner of means is a problem. He's a great professional. He's the ultimate professional. But is he the type of player you need now to drive you back on again, onwards and upwards? I'm not sure he is. Ditto for me, Hernandez. Ditto Poeta and one or two others, maybe even Jordan Hugel, who I know around the place as an architect in terms of the mood and the personality that he is worth his weight. But on the football side of it, is he going to improve Norwich's stock at the top end of the pitch? Not sure. So, yeah, there is clearly a need for a degree of reshaping, refreshing. And Dean Smith knows that quite clearly, because he was very open on Friday night that they do need to, thin the squad out, because I think there's too many there now who are on the journey who aren't going to really be big players in the Championship, and certainly wouldn't be if they reach the end goal, which is back in the Premier League. So whether that all happens in this window, probably not. But I think in the next window or two, you will see an acceleration in that process of trying to, thin the squad out. And maybe, again, as we were told previously, it's about quality, not quantity. That was the buzzword last summer. I think that was the buzzword in previous windows as well, that they want to drive up. It's just popped into my head, this sort of parallel, which is not a good parallel now, given Burnley have joined him in the Championship. But the way Burnley, up until last season, were able to stay in the Premier League with a a much smaller nucleus of a squad, but maybe the quality threshold was there. Now, clearly, they did fall through the trapdoor with Norwich. So, to a point, you accept it. But I think fundamentally, they've got too many professionals on the books now, and there's not going to be necessarily a lot of those, for me, who are going to be part of it moving forward. So, yeah, I think... But I would stop short of that Stuart Webber cautioned against something and has now engineered a situation that he finds himself the one that he inherited. I think it is different. I don't think you have that end of an era to the same degree in terms of the group of players, because I think the hunger had gone out of that group, and they were on big money, and their appetite for what lay ahead for a club who were in a need of shock treatment wasn't really the case. I don't think that's necessarily the situation with this group of players. It's just that there's a few of these players who aren't good enough to move Norwich forward, I don't think.
And I would agree. And based on kind of what we've said there, Sam, it makes it feel like it's a bigger summer for maybe who leaves Norwich City rather than who comes in. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. Just mainly in terms of numbers, but also in terms of quality. I think the fact is, unfortunately, that when you get relegated, probably the players that leave are going to be more capable than a number of the players that come in. They're looking at probably, if you want to raise those sorts of funds, if you want to bring in significant amounts of money to fund other players, you're probably going to lose the likes of Max Aarons, Milo Rashica, Christos Jolis, as we spoke about before, and then probably coming in at players that you're taking more gambles on than those sorts of assured quality players that are leaving. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's pretty boring for fans, and it's probably quite boring for us as journalists covering it. But yeah, the fact is, probably most of the things you're going to see around the media and in talks around Norwich City are going to be which players are leaving, which clubs are interested in them, and that's what we're left with this summer, really. And it's quite unfortunate because it's a year after what was looking like one of Norwich's most exciting windows ever. There were parallels really with that sort of 2013 Ricky van Wolfswinkel, Gary Hooper, Leroy Fer summer in terms of the excitement in fans, and then the sort of drop off in terms of the performance from those players. So a year later to be looking at a summer of probably fringe players trying to be moved on is a bit less exciting. But I think that's the way that football's been really since sort of the COVID situation. It's become a lot more about players with slightly longer on their contracts than maybe clubs would like, and trying to shift players and trying to get other clubs to commit financially when the money situation, apart from for sort of Champions League clubs and clubs right up there, isn't great. Trying to find clubs for the likes of Shemslav Poeta, maybe Ono Hernandez or Daniel Sinani, if Dean Smith decides he doesn't want to keep either of those around, those sorts of players, Jordan Hugill, trying to get clubs in this financial climate to commit to those sorts of players is difficult. So that's probably the more tough part of Stuart Webber's remit at the moment, is trying to offload those players rather than trying to find the players to replace them. Because I think once he has the finances, to find a player that's going to produce in the Championship, in my opinion, is much easier than trying to get a buying club to commit to the likes of Christos Jolis or Shemislav Poeta or Ono Hernandez, because of the situation Norwich find themselves in, not only financially, but off the back of a pretty miserable relegation. How do you try and sell these players to clubs? So I think that's the task that Stuart Webber is facing this summer. And unfortunately, the task that Norwich fans are facing is consuming that sort of content this summer rather than the exciting content they were part of last summer.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying as well that continuity is not always a bad thing in football. Norwich have done it quite well after relegations from the Premier League in the last few attempts. They've managed to retain continuity and made a success of that, and maybe utilised that when lots of teams who've been relegated in the past have opted for significant amounts of change with varying degrees of success, be it Sunderland going all the way through, or even someone like Sheffield United who changed their coach, their style, tried to go for a completely different direction. It didn't work. So often Norwich have found continuity does work, which is why maybe watching someone like Burnley, who are trying to they've not just changed their coach, they're also trying to, or it seems like they're trying to completely change their their culture, their ethos, their philosophy, that's maybe where Norwich already have a leg up on them, and that will obviously remain to be seen. Perhaps they won't. Perhaps Burnley will hit the ground running. We'll see. But just as an example, you can kind of see the line of thinking, and overhauling a squad as a general rule of thumb doesn't usually translate to a team doing remarkably well in the Championship. You only need to look at Daniel Farke's first season in charge of Norwich City to figure that one out. And also, Sam, I think your comments about kind of what football is like more broadly at the moment with the difficulties in finances. We've spoken on this podcast before about Steve Morrison's comments, and that's just the Championship. That is repeated across the world, some in top divisions at top clubs. I was reading something the other day that said effectively now any Premier League club, maybe beyond some of the newly promoted ones, are now in a position where they can go and compete with any club in the world who aren't in the Champions League. That's quite a serious place to be in. And obviously Norwich aren't in the Premier League, so that makes life a bit more difficult financially, and it probably does lend itself to a few more loans. So, Paddy, if we kind of assess where Norwich City are at the moment, because I think the general perception is maybe that their squad isn't anywhere near complete, and it isn't anywhere near where supporters would need it to be to represent that shift that we suggested and we spoke about at the start of the podcast. It wouldn't represent that page being turned. Ultimately, only wins will do that in the Championship, as we said. And as Dean Smith has said before, winning is the best sticking plaster. But you can already see a scenario where Norwich perhaps haven't evolved their squad to what the fans would like. A difficult start to the Championship. Suddenly pressure does become really significant as well. So how much of this is about holding their nerve and not, we've used this phrase so much in the Daniel Farke era of ignoring the noise, that maybe feels even more significant at the moment, given maybe some of the conversations and the general discourse around their transfer activity at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I don't think in purely transfer-related terms, I don't think they would listen to the noise, because Stuart Webber's not one who seemingly is buffeted by ITK demanding whatever £25 million players to arrive at Carrow Road. He likes to poke fun at that, as we know, and he's also not one who, as a general rule, is there at 5 to deadline night, furiously pressing send on the file of fax or whatever, trying to get paperwork through. File of fax machine. Because I was a file of fax. I had a conversation with you about that, Connor, the other day. You probably boys don't even know what a file of fax is, do you?
I do actually. I used to sell them very occasionally on my Sunday shifts at WH Smith. So I know all about file of faxes. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, no. So we was delving into my file of fax with some numbers the other day. That's so I'm going off on a major tangent here, but fundamentally, I don't think, as I say, I don't think Norwich will have. And one thing you would say, irrespective of whether they got it right last summer, which they clearly didn't in terms of being fit for purpose for the Premier League, but they're very, since Stuart Webber arrived, very methodical, very measured in what they try and do in the window and working windows ahead. And of course, there was recruitment changes last summer, notably Kieran Scott eventually departing from Middlesbrough, who was Webber's right-hand person, you could say, prior to that. And that would have been a bit of a destabilising factor. But I think basically what they want to do this summer won't be impacted by what's happening or isn't happening around the game. I thought it was really interesting. We carried the quotes. Max Aarons is, the head of his agency, New Era, Jamie Morley, former footballer, talking more generally about the pace or lack of in the transfer window. And of course, there is a domino effect in the transfer window. The bigger clubs will do business. That money then circulates down the tree, and you see there is a knock-on effect. And he talked about this lack of continuity at clubs like Chelsea and Manchester United, principally, where there has been change. There is, in his opinion, maybe a lack of nous in terms of recruitment and putting deals together, and that's why those clubs have struggled to get business done. And he contrasted those with maybe what's happened at Arsenal now, where there is a very settled system in place around Mikel Arteta, and you can see that they were out the traps very early. They've done some very seemingly astute business, and the fact that there is that disruption at the top end of the game, maybe in England, maybe that's having a knock-on effect, because Max Aarons, he's been linked to those type of clubs in the past. And, if there'd been maybe more may certainly see it at Manchester United. I'm not saying Manchester United are particularly interested now in Max Aarons, despite what Rio Ferdinand wants to suggest otherwise at the start of the summer. But, if deals could have accelerated a bit quicker at the top end of the tree, maybe we'd have seen now that would percolate down to where Norwich are and where they are in the window. But, fundamentally, this all comes back round to Norwich are hamstrung in terms of they probably do need to sell those type of player to generate funds of a significant nature to do more than the one or two bits of business, which is probably where the measure is at the minute. So I certainly don't see a situation where Norwich are going to get bounced by whatever the sentiment is amongst their fan base into doing business that A, they don't want to do, or B, they're not able to do at the minute. So I think it's going to be more of the same. I think until something significant changes in terms of outs, don't expect much different to happen in terms of ins. And that's why, to take Sam's point, I think a lot of the activity is going to be around the pruning element of the squads at this stage. And by that, I don't mean the ones that they could actually sell for substantial sums. It's probably more the housekeeping element.
Agree. Good discussion, chaps. Just finally then, Norwich City obviously are in Germany this week as we record this in Bavaria, Krakow, I think, to be a bit more specific. You may have seen some of the videos or some of the social media posts from the players. It looks a very picturesque part of the world, but as Dean Smith, and you will have heard it in the chat earlier in the show, said it will be double sessions, triple sessions. It will be hard work as well as kind of bonding exercises as well. Norwich City obviously play a game on Saturday. I can already hear people asking if there's going to be a stream. I think that is probably the plan. Whether or not it gets executed, as was the case with Dereham on Friday night, we shall see. We're obviously certainly hoping that there is, because there will more than likely be some of us, if not all of us, covering that game from home. So our hope is that there is one, but we shall see. Obviously, that's up for the club to keep us updated on that. But otherwise, we'll, of course, keep you updated on all of our relevant channels, PinkUn.com and the PinkUn Plus app as well. If you're yet to try that out, no better time than in pre-season, with games coming thick and fast, stories coming thick and fast as well. We've got some really good content on there. Sam referenced a piece he's written on Todd Cantwell, which is going to be an excellent read. Paddy stuff from the weekend as well. Various bits and pieces to get your teeth stuck into, your one-stop shop for all things Norwich City. And as I say, you can get a 1 month free trial on that now if you want to see what all the fuss is about. And we think that you'll enjoy it once you get over there as well. I think that'll do us then. That's this week's PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again very, very soon.
Right now at TalkTalk, you can save £417 over 24 months versus BT on 900 megabits per second full fibre with total home Wi-Fi. Just £49 a month. So you can stream big, game big, and save big. Search TalkTalk. TalkTalk for everyone. CPI plus 3.7% annual increase from April 2023. Saving over 24 months versus BT full fibre 900 plus complete Wi-Fi £10 per month, $9.99 delivery subject to local availability. 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 Subject to local availability.